So I've been doing this for a while, and I know a preface asking people to not be idiots in the comments is pretty futile, but for one reason or another I'm still going to address what I assume are going to be 90% of the comments in opposition to this video before it even really starts. 1. Please, for the love of God, do not pretend that I said things in this video that I did not say in this video. If you really feel the need to argue with me, don't come into the comments debating a point that I never actually made because you expected me to make it. I know this seems obvious, but I'm not exaggerating when I say at least 70% of the comments on my past videos, even supportive comments, have just completely disregarded the things I actually said. Just watch the video and listen, please. Stop assuming I actually believe something that I didn't even talk about. Notice how I am repeating this point over and over. 2. I'm obviously going to be discussing fiction because that's what the video is about. I can already hear those of you with zero critical thinking skills tapping out a comment about how this is all fictional, so it doesn't actually matter, and I'd like to be the first to tell you to please shut up. Like it or not, pop culture, whether based in fiction or reality, is how our society generally digests and understands a lot more issues than it probably should. When I talk about fictional characters in this video, I'm not arguing that these fictional characters are being hurt or that they really matter as people. I'm discussing the very real impact that fiction quite obviously has on how people perceive real-life issues. 3. I know there are probably worse things in the world than what I'm going to talk about here. In less developed countries, especially mentally ill people are definitely treated even worse than I have personally seen. Believe it or not though, I can think more than one thing is bad at a time. Yes, a lot of other areas deal with mental health in ways that are awful. Even in America and similar cultures, there's more to focus on than just how media portrays certain things. But that's not what this video is about. That doesn't mean I don't care about other things, that doesn't mean those things don't matter, that doesn't mean I don't have opinions on those things, that doesn't mean those things shouldn't be fixed at all. It's just not the main focus of this one particular video because it's not what I felt like talking about for this one specific video essay. 4, and finally, I am fully aware that there are probably pieces of media that treat every single topic I mention in this video with respect and decency. A few examples of something done well, though, don't automatically cancel out the infinitely more popular and plentiful examples of it being done poorly, especially when these are the types of examples that are most widely accepted and seen by a general audience. I included a time step at the beginning for people to skip that preface so long as they don't feel the need to comment something so stupid that my eyes melt out of my skull, but if you see someone disregarding any of the things I just mentioned, please feel free to spam them with nothing but the timestamps to the part where I directly address whatever they're ignoring or didn't bother to watch. Now to actually start the video. When most people think about how mental health is portrayed in popular media, especially in terms of controversy surrounding these portrayals, their minds would probably jump very quickly to something in the vein of 13 Reasons Why. If, by the grace of God, you aren't privy to this Netflix series and the contention surrounding it, essentially it has garnered a lot of attention for being a miserable representation of depression, and despite being marketed as a series meant to bring awareness to the stigma surrounding mental health while working to help erase that stigma, it actually contains a lot of very graphic imagery that at best romanticized and glorified harming oneself, and at worst actively triggered those that have dealt with self-harm into a relapse or copycat suicide. To most people with even a basic understanding of what it's like to live with depression, everything about this series is awful, yet en masse, 13 Reasons Why is often seen as the piece of media to bring mental health awareness to a mainstream audience, at least on the scale that it did. There's already a million videos and a million tweets and a million blog entries and a million written essays and a million arguments about how distasteful and disrespectful 13 Reasons Why really is, so I'm not going to put a significant amount of focus on discussing every individual thing it does wrong. I found it all but impossible to make this video without at least mentioning the series though, not really due to its notoriety but because of its usefulness as a point of comparison. Despite every horrendously mishandled subject present in 13 Reasons Why, at least it doesn't perpetuate a narrative that people with depression are to be feared or otherwise viewed as subhuman pieces of garbage long beyond even the slightest chance of any type of human connection. Obviously, I wouldn't say this means it's good. I wouldn't even say the series' heart was in the right place. It was more a poorly thought out cash grab due to the book's undeserved popularity. But I also don't think the series actively set out with the intention to hurt or demonize people with depression. In that regard, compared to other pieces of media that deal with virtually any other type of mental health problem, 13 Reasons Why is basically a masterpiece. People know depression exists. exist, and people have at least a general idea of what it is. Whether or not it succeeds, media typically at least tries to create the illusion of giving depression a legitimate portrayal. Compare that to something like dissociative identity disorder, the dissociative disorder previously known as multiple personality disorder. I would bet money that most of you have not even considered the very real role that this disorder plays in many people's lives, or the reasons that it exists. It's not that people just believe it's something that's only in fiction, it's that people don't even consider whether or not it's real. If you don't know, dissociative identity disorder in the real world stems from absolutely horrific abuse endured as a young child. Not everyone abused will automatically have this, but when they do, it always comes from deeply traumatic events happening over and over while the victim's mind is still developing any sense of identity. It gets so horrible and impossible to endure that to cope, the person's mind fragments itself so that each fragment can take at least a section of the pain away. The things someone has to endure at such an incredibly young age to even stay alive long enough to develop something like this are genuinely too difficult for me to even describe in detail, though I'm sure you can read about some survivors' stories online somewhere if you so choose. More importantly though, there's absolutely no connection to having this disorder and exhibiting violent behavior towards others. In fact, if you've ever been close to a survivor of childhood abuse, you probably know their trauma has done just the opposite for them. Abuse during key developmental phases of one's life often makes them feel like they have to constantly look out for others' best interest over their own well-being, because that's what they were taught got them any of the love they may have had. Working through the turmoil that comes with this, the huge variety of relationships these people have, how differently each of these relationships must be navigated at different points in time, and either coping with or trying to understand the purpose and role that each alter has, or if the alters even have a set purpose or role, or which is most in control at any point in time and the implication those things have on everything else in the world, are all interweaving lines of thought that virtually anyone with DID has to deal with and try to understand throughout their entire life. You'd think something like this would be grounds for several kinds of fantastic character studies in a variety of media. It would probably be difficult, but not only would it be genuinely new and interesting, it could make someone with DID who has always felt alone or misunderstood finally feel like at least one other person in the world kind of understands them. In reality, if you've watched any piece of media that displays a character affected by DID, there's at least a 70% chance that that character was a murderer. The most recent perpetrator of this cliche, at least in my personal recent memory of pop culture, is M. Night Shyamalan's Split. If you don't know, Split was supposed to be this director's big revival coming out of hilariously bad movies like Avatar: The Last Airbender and After Earth. And instead of making something new, interesting, or just well written, he took these harmful tropes and made a gimmick out of demonizing them. What makes this one stick out more than others, other than it being the most recent, is that it's clear the scriptwriter did some research into DID, because the movie has the gall to name drop the disorder and explain certain modern phenomena that have been documented at least once as being associated with it, such as different alters having different physical attributes like slight differences in body temperature. But this very real mental health issue is still just a poorly executed gimmick for this mediocre horror movie for audience members to gawk and gasp at. That's one big problem with these types of movies. If a film's or a character's whole shtick is that a mental disorder is involved, the writers take the most absolute extremes of everything documented about the disorders in sensationalist articles and throw all of those incredibly rare symptoms into one character, creating a person that, one, could probably never exist in real life, and two, only serves the purpose of being gawked at by viewers like a circus animal. This is present for basically any type of obscure mental disorder in a work of fiction, so much so that it would be impossible to address how each one of them is specifically dealt with in movies that make no attempt to truly understand them. So I encourage any viewer to do more research into other mental health problems and actually look into forums for those who have experience with cluster A, B, or C disorders, or dissociative disorders, or basically anything other than depression, anxiety, and even PTSD. Focusing on DID specifically though, it is very, very rare for alters to behave in the way that they do in Split or in any other media that portrays them. Despite the movie trying to pretend it's giving at least a potentially realistic look into a, need I remind you again, very real affliction. Each alter in Split is a fully developed person with their own memories and experiences and names and lives that could probably exist separately from each other if they weren't in one dude's body. This is far from the norm for people with DID though, to the point where it's often been debated in official capacities if it's even actually something that occurs. It's also technically possible for alters to be age regressed progress, though not really to the capacity that it's seen in Split, and for alters to have different genders, and for alters to be all kinds of different people once they've started to develop on their own in a person's head, but for this to all be together in one character to the extent that it is in Split is far from realistic. I described alters before as fragments because they're almost never fully fledged people. They can be named, but it's usually just to help differentiate them in someone's head or so that person can discuss each alter with other people. It's different for everyone with DID. For some, many alters could be present at one time, discussing things with each other, with one really piloting more so than the others. For others, there's one constant pilot alter, but it gets pushed around and controlled by another or several alters. It can also be a mixture of these or a different type of system entirely. There's usually memory overlap between them, so if some are present but one in particular is control, the person will remember certain things as long as the other alters are present in the background. Usually the alters have conflicts, and depending on how one's head is set up to deal with them, they always play out and resolve in different ways. There's a lot of different setups, all of which are more interesting and dynamic than, ooh, spooky, another really overblown personality, but it's one body, ooh! Doing what Split did, pushing the absolute farthest ends of every possible symptom of a mental health issue despite clearly only conducting absolute bare bones research into what living with that mental health issue actually entails, only serves to create a caricature of the disorder and the people that live with it. I'll talk more about that later though. I just can't help but think how much better a movie like this would have been if someone or several people who actually live with a DID were actually consulted during its creation. But no, for some reason taking these real struggles that people have and turning them into a sideshow circus act so that people can treat and view these people as less than human for their own entertainment is the option every creator of popular media decides to go with. Of course, they do this not to provide a harsh depiction of how mentally ill people have to live ordinary day-to-day lives, having endured the horrific traumatic events that they have, as well as the hold and weight that those events have on them throughout the rest of their life, but as a method of making them a creepier murderer. And really, what is there to say about this? Everything about any way you spin these plotlines and characterizations is just an awful stigma to push for the sake of a bigger profit. At the very best, media like this contributes to an unhealthy view of mentally ill people in society. When they're used as gimmicks like this for the sake of advertising, you're dehumanizing the actual sufferers of these illnesses who have very real experiences. To an outsider, someone with DID or any type of mental disorder is just crazy or psycho. They're less than human. They and their experiences are little more than punchlines in a fictional world. These mental illnesses aren't viewed as responses to trauma or anxiety or even just a cruel choice of fate. Their reasons for existing and the actual effects they have on people that live with them aren't even considered at all. They're viewed solely as a sign that someone is so far gone that trying to understand or help them is not just a lost cause, it isn't even a thought to be had. They're perfect for a unique plot point in a storyline that needs an antagonist, maybe one with a troubled past, but still just an antagonist whose motivations need to answer either why are they remaining a bad person after their past, or why are they a bad person in the first place? Well, they're mentally ill. Simple, easy answer with no effect on anyone in the real world, right? And this is still the best case scenario, even trying to look at these characterizations through a lens of hope and positivity. The stigma of just being too far gone to help and only being relevant as a plot point for normal people to view as entertainment while shoveling popcorn down their throats is the brightest interpretation of how most people view mental illness. On the other side of the same coin, you have this idea that anyone who's mentally ill is someone to be immediately feared. You can't socialize with them, you can't rationalize with them, they're just monsters. They're inherently bad people and there's no fixing it, which in turn means mocking and attacking them is fair game. Psychotic disorders are also a big victim of this view, of course largely due to pieces of media featuring a murderer character, or at best an awful person character, with symptoms of psychosis. It's hard to even talk about psychotic disorders because of all the ideas that surround their very existence. Even the word psychotic is typically used by people to generally describe something or someone terrible. Its actual definition is just in relation to the term psychosis, which is a symptom of a lot of things, but is usually paired with psychotic disorders. A diagnosis of a psychotic disorder shockingly doesn't consider how good or bad a person is. All it entails is a particular detachment from reality, and other than a genetic predisposition, there's usually nothing to suggest a particular type of childhood or past experiences have much of an effect on if someone has a psychotic disorder. Schizophrenia is probably one of the most well-known psychotic disorders in the world, And again, schizophrenia is something that many people actually have. It's another mental illness that, while in an entirely different family than DID, is comparable to it in how popular media has handled it, that being as a horror gimmick for shock value in place of grounded, decent storytelling. It's probably been directly named a bit less than dissociative identity disorder or multiple personalities, but whether or not the name is present, the harmful ideas of symptoms associated with it are. Hallucinations and subsequently voices inside one's head are common symptoms of psychotic disorders. These can be absolutely horrifying and debilitating for people affected by them, but generally nothing about a psychotic disorder makes someone inherently dangerous, except maybe to themselves. Yes, there have been cases where someone affected by these symptoms do seek to hurt other people, but these cases are not the norm. They're not even close to it. There's only a handful of them, and of those, there's even less that result in the kind of remorseless murderer that media so often loves to push as being standard for someone living with schizophrenia or a similar illness. Sufferers of these extremely severe and extremely rare symptoms of a psychotic disorder will usually seek treatment of some kind, especially if they realize they're even beginning to put someone else at risk. And even if they didn't or couldn't, the likelihood that they would have seriously hurt someone anyway because of their mental illness teeters between the edges of low and non-existent. Despite all of this being proven researchable fact, with innumerable scientific reports proving the virtually non-existent, if not entirely non-existent link between these mental health problems and violence towards others, a majority of prevalent killers in popular media, if they aren't affected by some supernatural force, or sometimes even if they are, will display all of the symptoms of some type of psychotic disorder. If you're lucky, the movie will just straight up name drop schizophrenia. Either way, the stigma is the same. People associate these things with these types of disorders, even if they don't know the proper names for them and their classifications. As I try to think of any piece of media in particular that either portrays people with these disorders in a horrendously negative light or just otherwise features a poorly done mockery of what a psychotic disorder actually is, going into detail on every specific piece of media popping into my head seems increasingly redundant and pointless. Because, for one, many of my criticisms would be virtually identical to the ones I had for Split, but also because the most famous pieces of media that do this are so heavily ingrained in modern culture and cinema, there's no way any typical viewer hasn't come across at least a reference to one of them in something they've enjoyed. Psycho, featuring the infamous shower murder scene, is literally called Psycho. Do you think they just invented that word for the sake of titling the movie? No, it's short for psychotic. And especially as the series continued, symptoms such as voices and hallucinations were heavily employed in its storytelling in unrealistic ways. The Shining, while also featuring paranormal aspects, makes notable use of hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and other symptoms of schizophrenia to illustrate a character's descent into a bloodthirsty killer, after starting as a fairly average husband and father who had none of these symptoms. If you look anywhere else in any movie or book or other piece of media that wants to show a descent into madness for one reason or another, you will almost always find these kinds of depictions. Because this is just how it's done now. People, for one reason or another, as a whole, have decided that these symptoms of mental illnesses that people must live with and suffer from every day are reason enough to be afraid of those people. And it's so fundamentally ingrained now into our understanding of both fiction and mental health that it's often genuinely difficult to even recognize these trends in filmmaking as being harmful depictions of real people, especially for those who have no experience with these people. I promise, I understand that fact. I'm not accusing anyone of knowingly contributing to a harmful view of these groups of people just by watching and enjoying these movies. When scripting this video, I considered very heavily the role these depictions have, and if they were even actually depictions of mentally ill people. But the simple fact of the matter is, yes, at the very least, these directly parallel mental health issues and will always have an effect on how the mass majority of people view those issues. Because even if it isn't stated that a character has schizophrenia or DID or another mental health problem that I may talk about here, those symptoms are shown, and the average audience member will view these symptoms in one of two ways. As symptoms of a general descent into madness or a mentally unwell character, whatever you want to call it in whatever context it's in, or as symptoms of whatever disorders that they know to be attributed to those symptoms, whether it be through the media itself directly naming it or pre-existing knowledge from other media that directly named it. And either way, in some capacity, these depictions will always be connected to specific mental health issues. Even if the audience doesn't attribute a negative depiction of symptoms of schizophrenia directly and exactly to schizophrenia, schizophrenia, they will still attribute the things shown, like hallucinations and delusions, to a negative, dangerous image. And the only real difference is that they're judging those who display symptoms of a certain disorder rather than having the name of the disorder to hone in on. In other words, there's essentially no difference. Someone's reaction to a person with schizophrenia would be the same if they just watch a horror movie where a character's hallucinations told him to murder someone, whether or not the word schizophrenia was directly stated in that movie, because someone with schizophrenia will still display that symptom of hallucinating, and likely a lot of other symptoms that killer character displayed as well. I'm honing in on this so much because I feel like it's a really popular justification for this type of media's continued existence. It's not harmful because there's no specific illness that these symptoms are linked to, at least not by name in the media displaying them. They're just plot points or characterizations of mental instability that are completely separated from anything based in reality, so it's fine. But while that's an argument to make, yeah, we all know it's just not true. That's not how the vast majority of people perceive these things, whether or not they're consciously aware of that. Talk to anyone who hasn't specifically dedicated time to educating themselves on mental health, and whether or not they know it, these pieces of media are almost 100% of the time how they will comprehend all the symptoms of lesser known mental illnesses. It's easy to understand that someone in a movie who hallucinates or has alters or dissociates or has less of a connection to others or any other trait of an illness like this is not mentally well. Most people do not experience these symptoms, meaning to the average audience member, they are easily viewed as a sign that someone isn't normal or mentally healthy. That association being made, consciously or not, affects how people view these symptoms. There's just no way around it. If you contribute to false ideas associated with any group of people that the mass majority isn't educated on, it will affect that majority's understanding of that group of people. And yes, the mass majority's understanding of anything in general, but especially something as sensitive as mental health, does matter, because the general public's understanding of a group of people shockingly directly affects how that group of people is treated. For one, if general knowledge of any group of people is just misinformation about them, depicting them in as negative a light as possible, most people will obviously not treat anyone in this group with the basic decency and respect they deserve. Even applying extremely basic reasoning skills, one can deduce that if most people's first reaction when they learn something about you is, "Oh, like the horrible murderers," you're not going to be treated well. On a larger scale though, less interest in understanding a group of people also means less interest in helping them. Prospective therapists can go into their studies focusing on particular issues that they want to help treat. There's a lot of different areas of specialty that a therapist can choose to focus on for their clients. Obviously, there's different branches like couple counseling, children's therapists, behavioral therapists, etc., but even the ones that focus specifically on mental illnesses have a lot of subcategories that they may fall under. And if you've ever looked into getting professional help for a mental illness other than depression or anxiety, you probably know how difficult it can be. Therapists that have chosen to specialize in and research less commonly understood mental illnesses such as DID or schizophrenia are a lot rarer than ones that deal with more commonly known issues like depression. This means that, especially if you live in a less populated area, you might not find a professional who can truly understand your specific circumstances and that you can reasonably visit on a regular basis at all. And if you can find someone like this near you, they are almost guaranteed to be a lot more expensive than anyone else, largely because they have no competition and are less likely to be heavily tied to a set of rules put in place by a particular institution. Granted, they may be a bit more pricey anyway if they have more versatility than therapists who have a strict focus on depression or anxiety, but that doesn't change the fact that a lack of competition multiplies the potential price of anything to an almost infinite degree. Basic economics classes will teach you this. For someone with, for example, symptoms of a personality disorder, the options can quickly become A. See a therapist that doesn't understand how to help you, B. See this specific therapist for an outlandish price, or C. Just don't get any help at all. And that's, again, assuming you even have the option, because for a lot of places, especially smaller towns, there's no conceivable way to make a regular trip to even get to the therapist you need. Yes, there's ways around it, mostly through something like Skype or Google Hangouts, but these have massive downsides, like no potential for physical activities, a lack of privacy, connection problems, technical limitations, either of the computers or either part party using them, a big hump to get over when forming any kind of emotional connection with your therapist, figuring out a secure payment method that works for both parties, getting no answer from someone you really need an answer from and having no other way to contact them, blah blah, you get the point. It's just not an option for a lot of people, especially younger people who can't explain to their guardians why they want this specific therapist that is either 30 minutes farther than others, way more expensive, or both. Because, and we're coming full circle here, of how difficult and scary it can be to admit to anyone, even your family, that you think there's something going on with you that's deeper than just depression or anxiety. This alone is a terrifying cyclical process for a lot of people that want help but need it for something less traditional. One that traps so many people, especially younger ones, into a downward spiral that they may never fully recover from and they may feel as endless. For many of them, it may very well be endless. I do get that making a video focusing on pop culture and fictional pieces of media can feel like just another debate over things that aren't real in place of calling for an actual reform of our currently terrible mental health system. This doesn't just start or end with a sudden decision to overhaul our system in its entirety, though. Media portrayal, audience reactions, the general public's views on mental health, interest in studying and treating less common mental health problems, it's all somewhere in one cycle, or rather multiple interconnected cycles, with every piece of each of them interacting with and affecting the others. As is the nature of a cycle, there's no one place that any of this begins. It's difficult, but to change or stop it, you have to attack a cycle in the middle. If we had more positive, or at least more realistic representation of mental health problems, even if it were just one really influential, really popular film, it would at least spark discussion around the realities of those problems. If a general audience knows about those realities, media created by and for those audiences would probably shift, even if only slightly, in a better direction. Subsequently, more people would probably take the time to learn more about those mental health problems, take an interest in educating others about them, or even study to become a psychologist that focuses heavily on those mental illnesses. This is especially prevalent now that the line between average person and content creator has been blurred out of existence with the positions that YouTube has given to many otherwise regular people. In fact, some of you might think that this video is being made in direct response to any number of particular things that have been perpetuated by popular online content creators. Shane Dawson's series on Jake Paul definitely comes to mind, as it surprisingly actually sparked some controversy and would probably be a hot talking point. But no, I've actually been wanting to make this video for years now, and I started jotting down ideas for the outline long before Shane Dawson even announced his series about Jake Paul. In fact, that's happened a lot since I started planning this video. Multiple times in the middle of scripting, I've taken a break to watch something on YouTube or read tweets, and I'll just happen to come across something either making mental health into a punchline for non-mentally ill people to laugh at, or better yet, just outright demonizing them. And I don't think this usually comes from a place of malice, but rather complete ignorance, because where would they have learned about mental health if it isn't just general knowledge and isn't taught in any of the media that they consume? For just one example, take the gaming channel Arlo. Many of you might not know much about him, but his entire persona is based on just being a goofy, kid-friendly puppet. Nothing he does could be considered even remotely edgy. He doesn't even swear in his videos. But still, in the middle of scripting this, I clicked on a notification for one of his new videos, and lo and behold, it ended with a joke about voices inside crazy people's heads, complete with a line about a van taking him away in a straitjacket.
I hope you are now a believer and that you've called off the white van that was on its way to my house with a straitjacket. So, my newly enlightened viewers, why don't you head down to the comments and tell me what these numbers say to you? In the meantime, I'm gonna keep listening. What's that? Xenoblade Chronicles 2's 1.42 million? You want me to put cheese in Loxton's underwear drawer? I don't know if that's a good idea, but if you say so.
Obviously, I really doubt Arlo looked at symptoms of something like schizophrenia or DID and decided, yeah, I'm gonna make fun of these people suffering. Doing so is just what is generally seen as acceptable to anyone who hasn't specifically thought to learn more about it, because they probably haven't even entertained the concept that the stuff they're turning into a punchline actually affects real people, largely for the reasons I talked about earlier. And I call it a punchline because that's what it is. There's not even really a joke behind it, because mental illness is the joke. After all, it's just a ridiculous hypothetical that doesn't affect reality, right? Aside from that, it's just, not funny, because there's absolutely no punchline here that hasn't been used ad nauseum for anyone who tries and fails to be a comedian. That said, things in this vein obviously get worse than a brief joke told by a Muppet who really just seems to be a bit ignorant on the reality and weight behind the topic, which he's presumably never seen much of a reason to do any research on in the first place. So, about Shane Dawson. If you don't know what happened, Shane Dawson made a series focusing on Jake Paul, following the popularity of his other similar docu-series. A fairly substantial amount of attention for this set of videos, however, was put on the fact that Shane would bring in an actual mental health professional to analyze Jake Paul and determine if he was a sociopath. Let's get one thing straight. Jake Paul is fairly reprehensible. His popularity and ability to manipulate huge masses of children have gone so far into his head that he is basically incapable of determining right from wrong because all he has ever known is praise. But this armchair diagnosis of him as a sociopath or a psychopath has never been rooted in any form of understanding of the science of psychology. For one, sociopath doesn't really mean anything, at least not scientifically. No matter what mental health professional you bring in, someone cannot in the current year be diagnosed as a sociopath. If the words sociopath and psychopath ever had a meaning rooted in any legitimate study of the mind, it has been mauled, its flesh feasted on, and the remains of its carcass left to rot in the sun by its modern usage. But even though these terms have no bearing on a real diagnosis and are subsequently completely interchangeable, people have taken a huge interest in the technicalities and realities of each. If you've never heard, read, or participated in a discussion on the differences between a sociopath and a psychopath, either you're incredibly fortunate and in the minority, or you're lying. These dialogues may seem interesting to someone who has never actually done research into actual personality disorders, but I cannot stress enough just how absurd they become with the very basic knowledge that there is no such thing as a diagnosis of psychopath or sociopath. People have their own personal definitions, and they're all loosely connected to real personality disorders, which I'll talk about in a bit, but debating about their differences or the realities of either is completely worthless because it's all just random nonsense, the accuracy of which every individual decides for themselves. This is part of why Shane Dawson's decision to include a real psychologist in his series on proving Jake Paul is a sociopath is so weird and crummy, because while anyone can call him a sociopath, that doesn't really mean anything unless you decide it does. You cannot examine someone and diagnose them with sociopath. It's just a word that the masses have decided has an extremely negative connotation and marks someone that should be feared. To bring any discussion of actual mental health problems into play, like a real psychologist, and analyze someone as if they're being a sociopath as an objective fact that can be proven or disproven, is not documenting or researching anything. It's just playing off the general public's complete lack of understanding of anything about what mental health is. This doesn't mean the term sociopath is completely separated from mental health, obviously, because people still use it to describe what they think is a simple, concrete definition of what is actually a complex disorder. Most commonly, it's viewed as being synonymous with symptoms of antisocial personality disorder, oftentimes just being used interchangeably with that disorder. Admittedly, if you just read the symptoms of ASPD on Wikipedia or a lot of other widely available sites, you would probably come away with an image in your head of someone hell-bent on bringing harm to others, be it physical or emotional. I had to dig deep and really do some research on the disorder, and after reading a lot of popular articles about it, I can understand why a person who hasn't talked to someone with ASPD or read about the typical experiences of someone suffering from it would want to use it to characterize someone as just being bad. Again, it's cyclical, and no matter what, widely available documents will often reflect the common person's view of a disorder. And the most famous and easy to write about examples of ASPD, or at least the symptoms associated with it, are, of course, those of famous serial killers, even though these cases are incredibly rare, even in people with ASPD. Actually reading a first-hand account of someone living with the disorder or doing research on the reality of it, however, paints a fairly different picture. Signs of ASPD often begin early in childhood as a reaction to deep trauma such as heavy abuse and neglect, skewing the way one's brain comprehends certain feelings. Typically, symptoms showing up happens in direct response to something particularly traumatic like repeated sexual abuse. These feelings, especially for children, are so complex and horrible and confusing and terrifying that if someone has a genetic predisposition to ASPD, those feelings may manifest themselves in symptoms of it. The typical hostility, criminal record, and even the often played-up childhood cruelty to animals can sometimes be attributed to someone suffering from very severe ASPD, but all of these come from a deep inner turmoil and often dissipate as the person affected begins to learn more about themselves and their affliction, or otherwise learns to grow as a person. I'm not going to pretend to know more about this disorder than I do, but in any case, this caricature of a completely emotionless, self-serving robot who could feasibly kill someone and not feel an ounce of regret is just that. A caricature. People with ASPD can absolutely feel things. They aren't completely numb and devoid of any and all emotion and sympathy. They just experience those things in a different way than most people. Their feelings are notably less intense and often more rare than those of the average person. Their childhood cruelty to animals, if it's even present at all, often stems from harsh violence endured as, again, a child, and their undeveloped brains trying to find a way to process these extremely dark, complicated, and horrifying feelings as a kid whose toughest mental turmoil in life should be deciding on their favorite color. Their dulled emotions and boredom with the world also does not extend to the people they truly love. I read a lot of cases of people suffering from this disorder who genuinely cared for and loved their family, but once their family discovered their diagnosis and did their own quick research online, deduced that the person with ASPD was actually incapable of loving them and was only using and manipulating them to gain something. If you've ever really loved someone, romantically, platonically, familially, or in any other sense of the word, imagine how hard it would be for them to genuinely, truly believe that it was impossible for you to be telling the truth when you said you cared for them. For them to wholeheartedly accept not your word, not your feelings or your history or anything else between you, but documents they found online assuring them that all of those things, every laugh you've shared together, every heartfelt moment, every gentle kiss or hug or gift or other display of affection, was a lie. Imagine loving someone with every fiber of your being, as is more than possible with even the most severe cases of ASPD, especially when loving others and feeling things how you think you're supposed to, and experiencing these emotions in a functional, healthy way has been so hard to grasp and understand for your entire life. And because of misinformed opinions which you have no hope of controlling, they will always believe it's a lie. This narrative and the general public's poor understanding of not only ASPD but virtually every other lesser-known mental disorder is what Shane Dawson's series is promoting and furthering. Everything, right down to the tone being conveyed with the editing, which mirrors horror slasher films, despite the fact that these videos are not putting focus on anything inherently scary or dangerous. It's all poorly researched, horrendously thought out garbage to capitalize on the unwarranted fear and demonization of mental illness. What's worse is the legitimacy that he tries to add to this portrayal through hiring this mental health professional who only researched sociopaths right before this series because Shane Dawson asked her to. She is a familial and marriage counselor who made it very clear she has no experience with diagnosing ASPD. You could have hired a McDonald's employee who happened to have a master's in history to read a book or two, and you would have gotten about the same level of legitimacy that you have with this counselor. She was not brought onto this series to help Shane Dawson or the audience understand anything about this real personality disorder, or to actually assist in giving Jake Paul a genuine diagnosis that he could understand and learn from. Because if that's what Shane Dawson wanted, he would have asked at least a professional who actually had even a microscopic speck of understanding of personality disorders to give a genuine, well-researched explanation to any of the characteristics of one. She was brought on to push this false sense of validity and fear-mongering against this poorly understood disorder for views. Nothing about anything in this series and its malformed armchair diagnosis from these people who have never actually studied ASPD in their life and can't even call it by the correct name proves anything, except that to get views you could just maintain the status quo and step all over anyone who's already suffering. Don't get me wrong, this is a personal affront neither on Shane Dawson nor his series about Jake Paul. Like I said, I started planning out what I wanted to discuss long before The Mind of Jake Paul was even announced. I still feel as though discussing it is important because it truly is an almost perfect example of everything wrong with modern media's approach to mental health. Instead of working towards a genuine understanding of a disorder, it works towards affirming what people already believe and using that belief to validate a judgment of someone's character. Sociopathy, ASPD, whatever you want to call it, to the creators of this kind of media is already proof enough that someone is dangerous and scary. Rather than learn what it actually is, they want to use what they think it is, before and after they've conducted no real research in order to somehow prove something about a person's character. Because if Jake Paul was successfully proven to be a sociopath, then that somehow definitively proves he's a bad person. This kind of mindset nowadays is a big driving point behind armchair diagnoses like the one in Shane Dawson's series. I used that term earlier, and if you don't know, an armchair diagnosis is a diagnosis of a mental illness made without actually studying the one diagnosed. This tactic has fallen into heavy use recently as a surefire way to either explain or further demean the poor behavior of popular figures. I'm sure a lot of you who follow politics on social media can already see where this is going. Given the political history of liberals and conservatives, one would probably assume that those advocating for better treatment of the mentally ill would be on the left. It's just objectively more in the nature of liberals to focus on and care for the rights of minorities and those who are suffering. In cases of actually treating mental illness with any level of decency and respect, however, it's really difficult to notice much of a political leaning at all, at least within more influential voices. Following the rise in political popularity of Donald Trump, a man very widely regarded as bigoted, racist, sexist, homophobic, etc., you would be hard-pressed to scroll through tweets about his success without at least one in every 10 or so criticizing him, not for his policies or actions, but through an insinuation that he's afflicted with a personality disorder of some kind. There were, and still are, countless news articles and opinion pieces debating on or discussing the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder that Trump was apparently displaying. Naturally, many of these people weren't even psychologists, but rather just some writers who briefly read about symptoms of NPD on Wikipedia. And of course, none of them actually sat down with Trump because that would require an earnest attempt to develop some semblance of understanding of and sympathy towards those suffering from a real personality disorder. I won't go into ludicrous detail on it, but NPD is a fairly recent addition to the world of personality disorders, which stems from, surprise surprise, childhood trauma. Children who are consistently harshly criticized or punished for doing anything less than perfectly, thus being forced into the role of gifted child, will often develop a heavily skewed sense of self-worth characteristic of NPD. Those affected by NPD because of how they were raised have immense trouble naturally coping with failure. If you're raised only to feel like worthless garbage every time you make a mistake or don't do something perfectly during the point in your life which is most influential on your emotional maturity and development, those feelings will carry over long past your childhood. NPD is feeling like you're better than virtually everyone else because you were raised to have to be better than everyone else, but knowing in reality you aren't, and there's no way you ever will be, and not knowing at all how to cope with that fact. Negative comments directed at you can make you spiral into self-hatred, and the only time you may be able to feel real, genuine joy is if you're being showered in praise. Their bloated sense of self-importance and need for praise genuinely hurts them and comes from a place of a deep need to be accepted, not just pretension. There's a lot of nuance in this diagnosis because, as with every personality disorder, NPD is significantly more complex than someone displaying a negative trait such as having too big of an ego. It also tends to make the person afflicted with it suffer a lot more than it does the people around them. Twitter Democrats and armchair psychologists, though, immediately jumped on learning, "There's a personality disorder that makes you arrogant? Ooh," and opted to promptly diagnose a man that they did not like. As much as there already is to genuinely criticize Trump for, that sudden insistence that he's mentally ill was solely a method of dehumanization using mental illnesses and the public's already poor knowledge of them. In turn, this only really served to further push the stigma against those suffering from mental health problems. Because regardless of what you think of Trump, those diagnoses of a personality disorder were not an effort to understand him nor to help him understand himself. They were used solely as harsh criticism, and they shouldn't have been. Not because I particularly care if someone insults Trump, but because a mental health problem is not an insult. It's a reality, one that heavily affects a lot of people. Imagine if to criticize someone's policies or beliefs, we just started spreading myths that they were depressed or even that they had PTSD, and acting like that affliction made them inherently evil, instead of just, actually challenging their policies or beliefs. These people would be either rightfully disregarded or even challenged by almost all of their peers because it would be uncomfortable and weird to suggest those diagnoses were not only reason enough to degrade someone, but should be a part of the degradation in and of themselves. Yeah, obviously there's some weirdos who would actually wholeheartedly agree, but in general, the effort put into understanding those problems is just a lot greater than the effort put into understanding any personality disorders, despite the fact that they're all just different varieties of mental illness. And being mentally ill, while generally a bad thing in and of itself, does not make you a bad thing. But maybe to some people that's even scarier than if movies like Split or The Shining were a reality. Maybe everyone wants for there to be a reason for or a deeper meaning behind someone being absolutely terrible. Evil exists in the world, and maybe a lot of people are willfully ignorant to the reality of mental illness so they can categorize and neatly compartmentalize that evil into it. But that's not how it is. People do awful things all the time on a completely healthy mind, and they do those things for a lot of different reasons. People can just be arrogant, people can be violent, people can be mean and rude and bigoted and awful and a lot of other things, but that doesn't mean they're ill. It just means they're bad. It's easy to look at an influential figure's characteristic arrogance and convince yourself that a typical person couldn't become them. Not without something that's deeply wrong with them, something that can never be fixed, because if that's the case, it separates them from you. But none of that's true. People exactly like you can just be bad, and accepting that is a lot scarier than lying to convince yourself that there's a clear, distinct line to be drawn between the healthy and the evil. To anyone watching this, no matter how scary it is, I implore you to focus all of your disdain and hatred and even fear towards those who deserve it, and away from these groups of people who already suffer enough without the entire world clawing at their throats. Thank you for watching, everyone. Sorry this took so long, but I wanted to get it right. A follow-up video may come soon to address the things that didn't fit into the flow of this video. And a special thank you to my patrons for the month of November, including Lori, Rising Fan Artist, Susan, AP, Corpy, Tator, Blar, Invented Knight, Elia, Emil, Clementine, and Isaac. And if you'd like to support me directly and get your name in the credits, a link to my Patreon is in the description. I'll see you later.